Nobody in the sealed room moved for a long time after the words left the old woman's mouth. The photograph sat beneath the single hanging light. Hannah's small round face turned up toward a ceiling she would never see, and around the long table, men and women who had spent decades cultivating the particular stillness required to guard secrets, found that stillness, abandoning them one by one. An elderly man near the far end pressed a hand flat against his chest, as though checking that his own heart still worked. A woman, perhaps a decade younger than the one who had spoken, lowered her head and did not lift it again for several minutes. Historian G. Wunschik remained standing at the head of the table, watching the photograph pass slowly from hand to trembling hand, and understood, watching their faces, that he was witnessing something none of them had truly believed they would live to see. 9 years of careful silence. 9 years of a family too proud, too frightened, too uncertain of its own guilt to search openly for what it had once been forced to give away. And now, a single low-resolution photograph, taken through a garden hedge by a man who had risked a great deal to obtain it, had ended all of it in the space of a single evening. "We must confirm it properly," said a man near the middle of the table, his voice carrying the particular caution of someone whose entire career had been built on never moving too quickly. "A photograph is not proof. We have been wrong before. Twice, if the records serve me correctly." "The eyes," the eldest woman said, still holding the photograph, her voice quiet but absolute. "I do not need to be wrong a third time to know the shape of those eyes. I have seen them in a portrait, sealed behind glass for 40 years. I would know them if I were blind and someone only described them to me." "Nonetheless," the cautious man said, "we proceed carefully. If we are wrong, we risk exposing ourselves to a household that has no reason to trust us, and every reason to fear us, should our approach be clumsy. And if we are right," said another voice, older still, from the shadows near the far wall, "we risk something far worse. We risk being too slow and losing her a second time to whoever else may already be watching." Wunschik listened to the argument circle the table, the same caution and urgency he had lived inside for 11 months now, beginning to fracture the careful unity the council had always prided itself on maintaining. He did not join the debate immediately. He was still looking at the photograph, which had made its way back to him now, passed hand to hand around the table until it returned to where it had begun. "I will handle the verification myself," he said finally, and the table quieted, because in 41 years of service, historian G. Wunschik had rarely spoken with anything resembling command, and the unfamiliar weight in his voice now silenced the room more effectively than any argument could have. "Quietly, carefully. I will not approach the household directly until I am certain beyond any reasonable doubt, and I will not allow anyone at this table to move faster than that certainty permits. She has already survived one storm before any of us knew she existed. I will not be the reason she is caught in a second one before we understand what we are dealing with." No one objected. No one, in that room, was willing to argue with a man whose hands had trembled the way his had trembled an hour earlier. The eldest woman, still seated near the head of the table, studied him for a long moment before speaking again, her voice softer now than it had been when she first broke the room's silence. "You have carried this search alone for 11 months, Wunschik. Do not mistake my agreement for permission to carry it alone much longer. Whatever household is sheltering her deserves careful handling, yes, but you deserve support, and this council owes you enough trust, after everything you have already given it, not to let you walk into whatever comes next without allies at your side." "I am aware of what I am owed," Wunschik said, and something in the dry, tired honesty of it drew the faintest suggestion of a smile from the old woman, the first softening any of them had shown since the photograph first appeared beneath the lamp. "I only ask that whatever support this council offers arrives quietly. The household we are approaching does not strike me as one that responds well to visible pressure." "Then we will be as quiet as you require," she said. "But not silent, Wunschik. Not any longer. 9 years of silence is enough." The meeting dissolved slowly after that, the council members departing one by one into the winter night, each carrying the photograph's image behind their eyes, long after the physical print had been locked away in Wunschik's private archive, sealed inside a drawer that had not opened in 9 years and would not open again until he was ready. He remained alone afterward, the way he always did, sitting at his desk long past the hour. Any reasonable man would have gone to bed, staring at nothing in particular, feeling the strange, unfamiliar sensation of a search that had defined the last decade of his life, finally, quietly, beginning to end. He did not yet know her name. He did not yet know the household that had raised her. Beyond the single detail his investigator had passed along, with obvious reluctance. A name spoken low, as though naming it aloud might summon consequences the investigator did not care to face. He would learn it properly in the coming days, through channels far more careful than a photograph taken through a hedge. And when he learned it, he suspected, based on the particular tone in his investigator's voice, that the household guarding her would prove to be as dangerous in its own right as anything the council itself commanded. He found, sitting alone with that thought, that it did not frighten him the way it perhaps should have. A man who had spent 41 years protecting bloodlines from the world understood, better than most, that dangerous households sometimes made the safest guardians. It depended entirely on what kind of danger a man chose to become. At the Kang estate, 600 kilometers away, morning arrived the way it always did now, gently, with the smell of soup drifting up the marble staircase and the sound of small feet, not yet quite steady, but no longer entirely unsteady either, padding across the nursery floor, toward whichever adult happened to be nearest. Tae-jin had no reason to know that anything in the world had changed overnight. He woke, as he always did, to the particular silence of a house that had learned, over the last 10 months, to sound like a home rather than a fortress, and lay still for a moment, listening to it the way he always did, an old habit that no longer served the purpose it once had, but that he had never quite managed to abandon. He found Hannah already awake when he reached the nursery, standing at the crib rail with both hands gripping the wood, bouncing slightly on unsteady legs, her face breaking into the particular delighted expression she reserved only for him the instant he appeared in the doorway. "Good morning to you too," he said, lifting her, and she pressed her face into his shoulder for a moment before pulling back to study him, her dark eyes moving across his face with the same unhurried, almost deliberate attention she had shown since the first night in the rain, as though she were still, after all this time, confirming that he was really there. He did not know, that morning, that 600 kilometers away, an old woman had whispered his daughter's discovery into a room full of trembling hands. He did not know that a search which had begun before Hannah was even born had, overnight, transformed from a quiet institutional inquiry into something with a face, a location, a household to approach. He knew only that his daughter smelled faintly of the lavender soap Nurse Mijin used in her bath the night before, and that the winter light coming through the nursery window was unusually gold for so early in the morning, and that for the first time in longer than he could remember, he had woken without immediately reaching for the weight of the day ahead. She patted his cheek twice, an odd little ritual she had developed sometime in the last month. 2 firm pats, followed by a satisfied nod, as though confirming he had passed some private inspection, only she understood the terms of, and then squirmed to be set down so she could resume her pursuit of the small wooden bird, still sitting on the windowsill where Sunhee had left it weeks earlier. He set her down and watched her go, her progress across the nursery floor still more determination than grace, and felt, watching her, the particular ache of gratitude that had become so familiar over the last 10 months. It no longer surprised him when it arrived, only settled into his chest the way it always did, quiet and enormous at once. He carried her downstairs himself, past Yoon at his post, who produced the rabbit with his usual solemnity, drawing a delighted shriek that echoed down the marble hallway, past the sunroom, where Sunhee was already waiting with the soup, past the study, where Daeho's light was already burning, despite the early hour, a small detail Tae-jin noticed without quite registering its significance until later that afternoon. He found Daeho there just after breakfast, hunched over a spread of documents that had not been there the previous evening, his expression carrying the particular focused intensity Tae-jin had learned, across 2 decades, meant something had shifted. "You're here early," Tae-jin said, closing the study door behind him. "I didn't sleep," Daeho said, not looking up from the papers. "I kept thinking about the symbol, about what it would take for a research trail to run through 3 shell entities and disappear into something with the infrastructure to erase itself the moment we got close. I started running comparisons last night against every archived heraldry database I could access without leaving a trace. Most of them are useless. Modern registries, corporate logos misfiled as historical marks. Nothing that matched the stitching pattern our textile expert flagged. But there's a category of Korean heraldic tradition that predates the modern registry system entirely, Daeho said, finally looking up. Family and clan marks, used by the old aristocratic houses, some of them tracing back centuries, most of them dissolved or absorbed into the general population, generations ago, when the monarchy itself dissolved. A handful, though, maintained their marks privately, even after their public titles meant nothing. Ceremonial, symbolic, passed down through bloodlines that kept themselves quiet on purpose. Taejin crossed to the desk and looked down at the documents Daeho had assembled. Faded reproductions of old family crests, hand-copied symbols that bore, in some cases, a distant resemblance to the pattern stitched into the cloth, still folded in his desk drawer, though none of them matched it precisely. None of these are exact, Daeho said. But the style is close enough that I don't think we're looking at a criminal family or a chaebol house anymore, sir. I think we're looking at something older than either of those categories, something that predates the country's modern institutions entirely. You're saying she might be connected to the old aristocracy. I'm saying I don't know what I'm looking at yet, Daeho said, and that scares me more than knowing would. Old blood that maintained its marks privately for over a century, hidden well enough that even our best researcher can't place an exact match after weeks of searching. That's not the profile of a family that lost track of a child by accident, sir. That's the profile of a family that lost her on purpose and has spent every year since deciding whether they were ever going to look for her again. Taejin sat with that for a long moment, his eyes still on the faded crests spread across the desk, the particular stillness settling over him that Daeho had learned, over the years, to recognize as the deepest kind of thinking his friend was capable of. You said you don't have unlimited time, Taejin said finally. Explain that to me plainly, not the strategic version, the honest one. Daeho was quiet for a moment, choosing his words with unusual care. The honest version is that whoever is searching for her has already shown patience. Most people don't possess, sir. Months of careful, layered searching, never once triggering a mistake we could exploit. That kind of patience only exists in people who believe they have time to spare, or people disciplined enough to hide their urgency even when it exists. I don't know which we're dealing with. What I do know is that patience, once it finds what it's looking for, has a way of running out very quickly. If they're close to confirming her location, and I think the shell company activity suggests they are, then the calm, careful phase of this search may already be ending, whether we're ready for that or not. And you think we're not ready? I think we're readier than we were a year ago, Daeho said. I think you're a different man than the one who carried her in from the rain, sir. And I mean that as a compliment, not a criticism. But I don't think either of us has faced an adversary quite like this before. Every enemy you've ever fought understood the rules of your world. This one may not care about those rules at all. Keep going, Taejin said finally. But Daeho, if you find them before they find us, I don't want a confrontation. I want information. I want to understand what we're facing before either side has to decide anything. Understood, sir, Daeho said. Though I should tell you, I don't think we have unlimited time to gather that information quietly. Whatever's searching for her moved fast enough to trace 3 shell companies deep within weeks of her arrival. If they're patient enough to search for months without exposing themselves, they're also patient enough to eventually make a mistake we can catch. I'd rather catch it before they decide patience isn't necessary anymore. The morning continued in its ordinary rhythm after that, the household moving through its familiar patterns, unaware of the invisible current that had begun, overnight, to pull 2 separate worlds slowly toward each other. Taejin took a call from Minister Baek's office, finally agreeing to finalize the security contract Daeho had reminded him about weeks earlier. His attention only partially present through the negotiation, some part of him still turning over the faded crests spread across his desk. Sunhee spent the late morning in the garden with Hana, feeding the sparrows despite the cold, a ritual that had become, over the winter, less about the birds and more about the particular piece the two of them found together in the quiet. It was during that ordinary afternoon that the first small sign arrived, so subtle that Tae-jin nearly missed its significance entirely. He had taken Hana with him to the West Wing library after her nap, a room he rarely used for anything beyond the occasional formal meeting, its shelves lined with books that had belonged to 3 generations of Kang men before him, most of them unread in decades. Dust motes hung suspended in the pale afternoon light, slanting through the tall windows, and the room carried the particular smell every old library seemed to carry, regardless of country or culture: dry paper and aging leather, and something faintly like the passage of time itself. Hannah, newly capable of a wobbling, determined crawl toward anything that interested her, made straight for a low shelf near the fireplace, pulling herself upright against it, and reaching for a slim, leather-bound volume tucked between 2 considerably larger histories. "Careful," Tae-jin said, moving to intercept her before the book could fall, but she had already worked it free, and it slipped from the shelf and landed open on the rug between them, its brittle pages falling apart, at a section marked with a faded silk ribbon that had clearly not been disturbed in decades. He picked it up, expecting nothing more than an old genealogical record, the kind of dusty family history every noble Korean household kept somewhere in its libraries, and found instead, on the page the ribbon had marked, a hand-drawn illustration of an old ceremonial court, robed figures arranged in formal procession beneath a banner bearing a symbol he recognized instantly, the same intricate pattern stitched into the border of the cloth Hana had been wrapped in the night he found her. He went very still. Hannah, indifferent to what she had just uncovered, had already lost interest and crawled toward a nearby cushion, but Tae-jin remained crouched on the rug for a long moment, the old book open in his hands, studying the illustration with a coldness spreading slowly through his chest that had nothing to do with the winter afternoon. The book's cover, when he checked it, bore no author's name, only a title in old-fashioned script that translated, roughly, to Records of the Vanished Court, and a publication date nearly a century old. He had never noticed it on the shelf in his life. He could not begin to guess how it had come to be in his grandfather's library, or why, or whether its presence there was coincidence at all, and he found, closing the book carefully and setting it aside, that he no longer trusted the word coincidence the way he once had. He brought the book to Daeho within the hour, and watched his friend's expression change as he turned through its brittle pages, stopping on illustration after illustration of a ceremonial court that had, according to a brief historical note near the back, formally dissolved and scattered into private life nearly a century earlier, its surviving members sworn, by tradition if not by law, to maintain their bloodline's marks in absolute privacy. "This changes things," Daeho said quietly. "If this book has been sitting in your family's library for generations, that's not coincidence, sir. That's connection. Your family, and whatever household this symbol belongs to, have crossed paths before, long before you were ever born." "Find out how," Tae-jin said. "I want to know why my grandfather owned a book about a vanished royal court, and I want to know before whoever left that symbol on my daughter's cloth decides to explain it to me themselves." That evening, after Hana had been settled for the night and the house had begun its slow transition into quiet, Sun-hee found her son in the study, still turning the old book over in his hands, and something in his expression, some particular tightness she had not seen since the earliest, hardest weeks after Yuna's death, made her cross the room and sit across from him without being asked. "You found something," she said. It was not a question. He showed her the illustration and watched her face as she studied it, watched the particular stillness that settled over her features, a stillness he recognized because he had inherited it from her, the family talent for absorbing shock without letting it show. "I have seen this symbol before," Sun-hee said quietly, after a long moment. Tae-jin looked up sharply. "When? Many years ago. Before you were born, I think. Or perhaps when you were very small. I do not remember precisely. Your grandmother, my husband's mother, kept a small lacquered box in her room that she never allowed anyone to open. I saw inside it only once, by accident, when I was a young bride still learning the rules of this house. There was a piece of cloth inside it, folded very carefully, with this same symbol embroidered into its corner. When I asked her about it, she told me only that it belonged to a debt our family owed, and that debts of that kind were not meant to be discussed. A debt, Taejin repeated. I never learned more, Sun-hee said. She died before I thought to ask again, and by then it seemed a strange, small mystery not worth troubling your father with. I had forgotten about it entirely until this moment, Taejin. I would not have remembered it all if you had not shown me this. They sat together in silence for a long moment, the old book open between them on the desk, the fire in the study grate burning low, and Taejin felt, for the first time since the rainy night, 11 months earlier when he had lifted a dying infant out of a roadside shrine, the particular vertigo of understanding that the story he thought he had been living was only a small, visible piece of something enormously larger, something that had been moving in the shadows of his own family history for generations before he was ever born. Do you still have the box? He asked. I do not know, Sun-hee admitted. It would have passed to your father when your grandmother died, and I never saw it again after that. It may still be somewhere in this house. It may have been discarded decades ago, the way old things sometimes are, when no one left alive remembers why they mattered. Then we searched the house, Taejin said. Every room, every storage space. I want that box found, Mother, and I want to understand what debt my grandmother believed our family owed to whoever wove that symbol. The search began the following morning, quiet and thorough, conducted by staff who had served the family long enough to be trusted with a task that required discretion above speed. It took 4 days to locate the box, finally discovered in a sealed storage room on the estate's 3rd floor, tucked inside a trunk of old ceremonial robes that had not been opened since before Taejin's father died. The lacquered box itself was smaller than Taejin had imagined, black with faded gold detailing worn thin by age, its hinges stiff with disuse. Inside, exactly as Sun-hee had described, lay a folded piece of fine silk cloth, considerably older and more faded than the cloth Hana had been wrapped in, but bearing, unmistakably, the same embroidered symbol in its corner. Beneath the cloth, folded separately, was a single sheet of paper, brittle with age, covered in formal handwriting that took Sun-hee, squinting through her reading glasses in the dim light of the storage room, several minutes to fully decipher. It's a promise, she said finally, her voice unsteady in a way Taejin had rarely heard from her. Written by your great-grandfather. It says that the Kang family accepts a sacred obligation, in gratitude for a debt too great to be repaid in ordinary terms, and that this family will, for as long as it exists, offer shelter and protection to any child of the vanished court who comes to it in need, without question, without hesitation, and without ever revealing the nature of this promise to those outside the bloodline. The room went very quiet. 100 years, Taejin said slowly. 100 years, and my family has been carrying an obligation none of us alive today even knew existed. Until it found you anyway, Sun-hee said, setting the paper down with careful, trembling hands. In the rain, beside a shrine, on the day you buried your wife, Taejin. I do not believe that was chance. I do not believe any of this was chance. Somehow, somewhere, whoever left Hana in your path knew exactly which family's door they were leaving her at. Taejin stood very still, looking down at the ancient promise his great-grandfather had written, a century before either of them existed, and felt something shift inside him that he did not yet have language for, something between vindication and dread, the sense of a man discovering that the ground beneath his feet had never been as solid or as ordinary as he believed. He thought of the prophet's words, spoken 3 months before he ever held her. Protect it before you understand it. He understood now, standing in a dim storage room with a 100-year-old promise in his hands, that the prophet had not been speaking only of fatherhood. He had been speaking of an obligation that predated Taejin's own birth by generations, an obligation that had, apparently, been quietly waiting inside his family's blood for the right moment to call itself due. He did not sleep well that night, and found himself, near 2 in the morning, standing once again over Hana's crib, the old silk cloth from the lacquered box folded in his hand, studying the symbol beneath the low nightlight, searching her sleeping face for some trace of the vanished world that had apparently been waiting for her long before he ever existed to protect her. She stirred slightly in her sleep, one small hand curling and uncurling against the blanket, and Taejin thought, watching her, that whatever ancient promise had brought her to his door, whatever bloodline she carried, that had made an entire dissolved royal house maintain its private marks for a century, in hopeful anticipation of exactly this moment, none of it changed the plain, immovable fact at the center of everything. She was his daughter. Whatever else she was, whatever else she would eventually turn out to be, that fact would not change, and he found, standing there in the dark with a century-old promise in his hand, that he was prepared to honor it exactly the way his great-grandfather had written it, without question, without hesitation, and, for as long as he could manage it, without letting anyone outside these walls understand what they were truly guarding. The following afternoon, needing something ordinary to hold on to after 2 days spent turning over a century of hidden obligation, Taejin canceled his meetings again, a habit Daeho had begun, half joking, to refer to as the chairman's new favorite negotiating tactic, and spent the day doing nothing more significant than teaching Hannah to stack a small tower of wooden blocks in the sunroom, the same blocks that had once been tucked discreetly behind an antique cabinet, and were now simply part of the room's furniture, no longer hidden from anyone. She was not particularly good at stacking yet, knocking each small tower down within seconds of building it with the total, gleeful satisfaction of a child who had not yet learned that destruction and creation were meant to be different pleasures. And Taejin found himself laughing more in that single hour than he had in the 2 anxious days before it, a laugh that surprised even him with how easily it arrived, how little effort it took now compared to the effort it had once required. Sunhee watched them from the doorway for a long while before joining, settling onto the floor beside her son, with the particular grace of a woman who had decided, decades ago, that dignity mattered less than being close to the people she loved. She rebuilt the tower each time Hana knocked it down, patient and unhurried, and Taejin, watching his mother's careful, weathered hands, stacking small wooden blocks for a granddaughter who might, for all any of them yet knew, carry the blood of a vanished imperial court, felt something in his chest settle into a kind of resolve he had not fully possessed the night before. Whatever came next, whoever eventually knocked at the gate claiming a century-old obligation of their own, this was what he intended to protect. Not a bloodline, not a promise written by a man dead for decades. This, a sunlit room, his mother's laughter, a small girl gleefully destroying towers she had only just learned to build. Everything else, the house of Yoren, the vanished court, the century of silence, existed only in service of keeping this exact, ordinary, precious afternoon safe for as many years as he could manage. Daeho's investigation accelerated in the days that followed, no longer searching blindly for a match to an unfamiliar symbol, but hunting now, with the specific, focused purpose of a man who finally understood the shape of what he was looking for. He traced the vanished court mentioned in the old library book through public historical records first, finding little beyond vague academic references to a minor branch of the old aristocracy that had quietly dissolved into private life nearly a century earlier, its official lands and titles absorbed by the state, its surviving members scattering into ordinary anonymity so thoroughly that most modern historians considered the bloodline extinct in any meaningful sense. He did not believe that for a moment. A century-old promise did not survive in his own family's blood by accident, sealed away in a box no one had opened in decades, and he suspected the same was true on the other side of whatever quiet arrangement had once existed between the Kang family and the household that had left Hana in the rain. He found his way, eventually, to an elderly antiques dealer in the old quarter of the city, a man named Cho, who had spent 40 years authenticating rare historical objects for private collectors and museums alike, and who had, according to a contact of Daeho's, a reputation for recognizing obscure heraldic marks that even academic historians struggled to place. Cho's shop occupied the ground floor of a narrow building squeezed between a shuttered tailor's storefront and a tea house that had clearly seen better decades, its interior crowded with glass cases of jade and lacquerware, and old scrolls yellowed with age, the particular hush of a place where valuable things had learned to wait patiently for someone who understood their worth. Cho himself moved through this clutter with the unhurried precision of a man who had spent so long among old objects that he had begun to resemble one, small and neat and carefully preserved. Cho examined the photograph Daeho had brought of the symbol, taken carefully from the old silk cloth in Taijin's study, and his expression, previously bored and professionally neutral, sharpened almost immediately into something far more guarded. "Where did you get this?" Cho said, setting the photograph down as though it had grown suddenly hot in his hands. "That's not important," Daeho said. "I need to know what it means, what family it belonged to." "It's not important," Cho repeated, with the particular flatness of a man who had decided, in the space of a single glance, that the conversation had already become more dangerous than his fee justified. "I think you should leave, sir. I think you should take your photograph and leave, and I think you should forget you ever showed it to me." "I'm prepared to pay generously for information," Daeho said, "and I'm prepared to guarantee your discretion. I'm not here to cause trouble for you, Mr. Cho. I only need to understand what I'm looking at." Cho studied him for a long moment, some internal calculation playing out behind his eyes, weighing, Daeho suspected, fear against curiosity, against the particular greed that made a man spend 40 years authenticating other people's treasures instead of building his own. He glanced once toward the shop's shuttered window, then toward the curtained doorway leading to his back room, as though confirming, out of long habit, that no one else was close enough to overhear whatever he decided to say next. "There was a family," Cho said finally, his voice dropping low, glancing once toward the shuttered front window of his shop, as though checking for watchers even here, in his own private domain. "Very old, very quiet. They called themselves, among those few who still knew to ask, the House of Yorin, descendants of a minor branch of the old imperial line, distant enough from the throne itself to survive the dissolution of the monarchy without drawing much notice, close enough that they never entirely gave up believing their blood mattered more than ordinary blood. Are they still active? Still searching for anything?" Cho's jaw tightened. "I authenticated a set of ceremonial jewelry for a private collector 11 years ago. The collector never gave a name, only an intermediary, and paid an amount that told me not to ask further questions. The jewelry bore this exact mark. I have not seen the mark again since, until you walked through my door 5 minutes ago, and I will tell you honestly, sir, I would be very happy never to see it again after today." "Why?" "Because families that guard their history that carefully," Cho said, "usually have very good reasons for the guarding, and men who come asking after that history uninvited usually find out those reasons the hard way." Daeho left the shop with considerably more than he had arrived with. A name now, the House of Yeorin, and the confirmation that whoever they were, they possessed both the resources and the discretion of old, careful money. Exactly the profile Daeho had suspected from the shell company searches months earlier. He returned to the estate that evening and found Taijin in the study, still working through the fragile pages of the century-old book his great-grandfather had apparently kept as a private reminder of an obligation none of his descendants had known to honor until now. "The House of Yorin," Daeho said, setting his notes on the desk. "A minor branch of the old imperial line. Old money, old discretion, exactly the kind of institutional patience Sukjin warned us about months ago." Taijin absorbed the name in silence, turning it over the way he turned over everything now, weighing its weight against everything he had already learned. "Do we know where to find them?" "Not yet," Daeho admitted, "but I have a name now, sir, and a name is something I know how to work with. Give me another week." He did not need a week. 3 days later, on a gray afternoon that carried the particular stillness of a storm not yet arrived, Yoon intercepted a man attempting to photograph the estate's front gate from a parked car half a block down the street, a car that had, according to the perimeter logs, appeared and vanished at irregular intervals over the previous 2 weeks, without ever triggering the formal alert threshold Daeho had calibrated, to avoid false alarms from ordinary neighborhood traffic. The man surrendered without resistance the moment Yoon and a second guard approached, offering no explanation beyond a calm, almost rehearsed apology, claiming to be a freelance photographer researching notable Seoul properties for an architectural publication that, Daeho confirmed within the hour, did not exist under the name the man provided. They held him only briefly, long enough to photograph his identification and vehicle before releasing him. Taejin's explicit instruction, given the uncertain nature of whoever they were now dealing with, being caution rather than confrontation. The man left without further incident, and Daeho's search of the vehicle's registration led, after 2 more days of careful tracing through Shell ownership records that had clearly been constructed by people who understood exactly how to hide behind paperwork, to a private security firm that, according to public filings, provided discreet protective services to a small number of clients, too wealthy and too private to be named in any public record. He wasn't a threat, Daeho reported to Taejin that evening, or not the kind we're used to identifying anyway. I think he was confirming what the Shell company searches already suspected, confirming that she's here. Confirming the household is exactly as dangerous as everyone assumes you are, sir, which I suspect is exactly why they've moved so carefully, instead of simply approaching the gate directly. They're afraid of me, Taejin said, and there was no satisfaction in his voice when he said it, only a kind of tired recognition. I think they're afraid of exactly what any sensible person would be afraid of, Daeho said. A man who runs half the city's underworld, who has already demonstrated he'll go to unusual lengths to protect a child he found in the rain, and who now apparently holds a century-old promise from his own family, obligating him to protect her specifically. If I were the House of Yeorin, sir, I don't think I'd approach that gate directly either. I think I'd want to be very, very certain of my welcome before I risked it. Taejin considered that for a long moment. Then perhaps it's time we stopped waiting for them to find their courage, and gave them a reason to trust the approach instead. Sir, if this family has spent a century maintaining a private mark, guarding a bloodline, keeping every trace of themselves hidden from the world, Taejin said slowly, then whatever drove them to abandon her, rather than raise her themselves, must have been serious enough to override a century of careful tradition. I want to understand what that was before I decide whether to let them anywhere near my daughter. Find their intermediaries, Daeho, not to threaten them, to open a door they've apparently been too frightened to knock on themselves. It was, everyone in the household would later agree, the correct decision, though none of them could have anticipated how quickly it would be tested. The following week brought a small, ordinary evening that would, in hindsight, prove to be the last one before everything accelerated beyond anyone's careful planning. Sunhee had taken Hana to the small neighborhood temple she visited monthly, a modest place tucked behind a row of ginkgo trees a short drive from the estate, maintained by an elderly monk who had known the Kang family for decades and asked no questions about the security detail that now discreetly accompanied Madame Sunhee's granddaughter on every outing. The temple courtyard was quiet at that hour, the way it always was on weekday afternoons. Golden ginkgo leaves scattered across the worn stone paving, like scraps of some forgotten celebration. The old bronze bell near the entrance, hanging still and silent in the windless cold. Sunhee had come here every month since Yuna's death, sometimes with company, more often alone in those early years, and had watched the ritual slowly transform over the last year, from an act of private grief into something gentler, something that now included, more often than not, a small girl's delighted shrieking as she chased leaves across stones her grandmother had once walked in silence. Hana, who had grown fond of the temple's quiet courtyard and the old bronze bell that hung near its entrance, toddled happily across the worn stone paving while Sunhee lit incense at the small shrine inside, a ritual she performed for Yuna's memory every visit, murmuring a few private words the monk had long since learned not to interrupt. It was the monk himself who first noticed the change in the old woman's face. He had known Sunhee for over 20 years, had watched her grieve her husband and, more recently, her daughter-in-law, and had come to recognize the particular quality of her silence during these visits, contemplative, sad, but steady. This time, watching her rise from the shrine and turn toward the courtyard where Hana was chasing a fallen ginkgo leaf across the stones, her expression carried something else entirely, a stillness so profound it bordered on shock. "Madame Sunhee," the monk said quietly, "are you unwell?" "I have seen that child's face before," Sunhee said, so quietly he almost missed it, her eyes fixed on Hana, with an intensity that made the monk turn to look at the little girl himself, seeing nothing unusual beyond an ordinary toddler chasing an ordinary leaf. Not this child. Another. Many years ago. I did not recognize it until this moment, in this light, at this angle. "I don't understand," the monk said, Sun Hee did not explain further. Not to him. Not that evening. She gathered Hana into her arms with unusual haste, thanked the monk in a voice that did not entirely mask her unsteadiness, and returned to the estate in near total silence, her mind turning over a memory she had not visited in over 3 decades. A young woman's face glimpsed once, briefly, at a formal gathering Sun Hee had attended as a new bride, a woman whose name she had never learned, whose family no one at the gathering had been willing to discuss above a whisper, whose eyes, Sun Hee now understood with a certainty that frightened her, had been exactly, unmistakably, impossibly the same eyes she had just watched, laughing over a fallen leaf in a temple courtyard. She remembered more of that evening now than she had allowed herself to remember in years, sitting silent in the back of the car, while Hana dozed against her shoulder, the memory unfolding with the strange clarity that only decades-old memories sometimes possessed, sharper somehow than the events of the previous week. She had been perhaps 23, newly married, still learning the elaborate unspoken rules that governed which family spoke to which at gatherings of that kind, still uncertain enough of her own place in the room to notice everyone else's with unusual care. The young woman had stood near the edge of the hall for most of the evening, dressed beautifully, but somehow apart from everyone around her, and Sun Hee remembered asking her own mother-in-law, quietly, who she was. Her mother-in-law's answer, delivered in the particular clipped tone she reserved for subjects not meant to be pursued further, had been only that some families carried burdens too old and too complicated for polite conversation, and that a wise young bride learned early which questions were worth the answers they cost. Sun Hee had not asked again. She had, in fact, largely forgotten the young woman entirely for the better part of 30 years, the memory tucked away in some rarely visited corner of her mind alongside 100 other small, unexplained moments that a long marriage into a powerful family had taught her not to examine too closely. She understood now, with a clarity that felt almost physically painful, exactly why that memory had chosen tonight to resurface. She found Tae-jin in the study that night and told him everything, the memory, the woman's face, the whispered warnings at that gathering decades ago that some families were better left unasked about, and watched her son's expression change as the pieces he had already gathered, the crest, the century-old promise, the House of Yorin, began arranging themselves around this new fragment into a shape neither of them was fully prepared to see. "You think Hana resembles someone specific," Tae-jin said slowly. "Not simply the bloodline in general, a specific person you actually met." "I think," Sun Hee said, her voice unsteady in a way he had rarely heard from her, "that whoever that young woman was, at that gathering 30 years ago, she may be the reason any of this is happening at all. I think, Tae-jin, that we have been searching for the wrong generation." Neither of them slept that night. Daeho was summoned before dawn, and by the time the winter sun rose fully over the estate, a new thread had opened in the investigation, one that reached backward rather than forward, searching now not only for the House of Yorin as an institution, but for a single young woman, unnamed, unremembered by nearly everyone, except an old woman's 30-year-old memory of a single formal gathering, a woman who might, if Sun Hee's instinct proved correct, turn out to be the missing link between a 100-year-old promise and the infant abandoned in the rain. It took Daeho 4 more days, working with a focus that left him hollow-eyed and unshaven by the end of it, cross-referencing decades-old guest registries from formal events the Kang family had attended, cross-checking names against fragments of the House of Yorin's carefully hidden paper trail, calling in favors from contacts who had not heard from him in years, and would, he knew, expect equally significant favors returned eventually. He found her on the evening of the 4th day, not through any single triumphant discovery, but through the patient accumulation of a dozen small confirmations, a name buried in a guest registry from 31 years earlier, cross-referenced against a birth record sealed under privacy protections that had taken considerable resources to circumvent, cross-referenced again against a photograph, badly faded, filed among the estate's own archived event records, from a formal dinner Tae-jin's father had hosted before Tae-jin was even born. He brought the photograph to the study that night, his hands, Tae-jin noticed, not quite steady as he set it on the desk. "I found her," Daeho said, "the woman your mother remembers." I cross-referenced the guest list from a dinner your father hosted 31 years ago, against records the House of Yorin has spent considerable effort trying to erase. Her name was Yorin Santhwa, 22 years old at the time of this photograph. A distant, unacknowledged member of the family line, kept largely out of public appearances even then, according to the sparse notes I could find. Taejin looked down at the photograph, faded and slightly warped with age. A young woman in formal dress, standing at the edge of a group portrait, her face turned partially away from the camera, as though she had been trying, even then, not to be fully seen. The resemblance to Hana, even accounting for the faded print and the passage of decades, was unmistakable. "There's more," Daeho said quietly. "I found a second record, harder to confirm, buried inside a private hospital's archived files from 11 months ago, the same week you found Hana. A woman matching this description was admitted under an assumed name for an emergency delivery and discharged herself against medical advice less than 6 hours later, refusing all follow-up contact. The hospital's records list no forwarding information, no family contact, nothing beyond a single note from the attending physician, expressing concern that the patient seemed, in his words, terrified, rather than simply exhausted. The study fell silent. She had the baby herself, Taejin said slowly, alone, under an assumed name, frightened enough to disappear within 6 hours of giving birth. "That's my read, sir," Daeho said. "I don't know why yet. I don't know who she was running from, or whether it was the House of Yorin itself she feared, or something else entirely. But I know this. Whoever left Hana at that shrine in the rain, on the exact night you would pass by on your way home from a funeral, the entire city knew about, timed it with a precision that could not have been an accident. And I think, sir, that the woman in this photograph is either the one who made that decision herself, or she is the reason someone else had to make it for her." Taejin picked up the photograph and studied the young woman's half-turned face for a long time, searching it for some echo of the daughter sleeping upstairs, and found, with a certainty that settled into his chest, like something being carved permanently into stone, that he was looking at Hana's mother. He did not know her fate. He did not know whether she was alive somewhere, watching from a distance the way the watcher outside the estate gate had watched, or whether whatever had frightened her badly enough to abandon her own newborn daughter to a stranger's mercy in a rainstorm had eventually caught up with her entirely. He knew only that a name now existed where none had before, Yeorsi Sionhwa, and that the name carried with it a weight he was not yet prepared to fully understand. "Keep searching," he told Daeho, setting the photograph down with careful, deliberate hands. "I want to know what happened to her. I want to know why a woman would give up her own child rather than raise her, and I want to know before I decide what to tell Hana, someday, about where she truly came from." Daeho nodded and gathered the photograph and his notes, preparing to leave, and paused at the door, looking back at his oldest friend with an expression that carried, beneath its usual composure, something close to genuine unease. "There's one more thing," Daeho said. "I debated whether to tell you tonight or wait until morning. I've decided you'd rather know now. Tell me." "The hospital record I found," Daeho said. "The one documenting her admission and discharge. I didn't find it through official channels, sir. I found it because someone else had already accessed it 3 days before I did, and left a digital trace clumsy enough for me to follow back to its source. Someone else is looking at the exact same record. Someone else already knows her name." Taejin went very still. "Do we know who?" he said. "Not yet," Daeho said. "But whoever it is, sir, they're not moving as carefully as the House of Yorin has been. They're not hiding behind shell companies and discreet photographers parked half a block away. Whoever accessed that record 3 days ago did it directly, through a private hospital's internal system, using credentials that trace back, as far as I can determine tonight, to a private security contractor with known ties to a rival organization, one of yours." The fire in the study grate popped softly in the silence that followed, and Taejin stood very still behind his desk, the photograph of a frightened young woman still lying where Daeho had left it, understanding, with a cold and total clarity that settled over him like the first drop of rain before a storm, that whatever careful, patient search the House of Yorin had been conducting for the better part of a year, someone far closer to home, someone who understood exactly how dangerous Kang Taejin could be, and had decided to search anyway, had just discovered the same truth he had spent the last 2 weeks uncovering. He thought of every rival he had ever made in 20 years of building an empire, every man he had outmaneuvered, every territory he had claimed at another family's expense, every enemy who had learned to fear his name enough to leave his household alone, and understood that somewhere among that long list of careful, patient grudges, someone had finally found a reason worth the risk of testing him directly. Not territory, not money, not even revenge in any ordinary sense. Something rarer and, he suspected, considerably more dangerous than any of those. A bloodline old enough and valuable enough that even men who feared him might decide the prize was worth whatever price his fury would eventually demand. He thought, too, of the sunlit afternoon, only days earlier, his mother's hands rebuilding a small tower of wooden blocks, Hannah's delighted laughter as she knocked it down again and again. An ordinary hour he had promised himself, in the quiet of his own mind, that he would protect above every other obligation this new knowledge had placed on him. He understood now, standing in the firelit study with a stranger's digital fingerprints leading back to a name he did not yet know, that the promise would cost him more than he had allowed himself to imagine only a week earlier. A century-old obligation was one thing to honor. A living enemy, already circling, already reaching for the same truth he had only just uncovered himself, was another thing entirely, and he found that some old, familiar part of himself, the part that had built an empire out of nothing but discipline and controlled violence, was already beginning to stir awake in a way it had not needed to in the 10 quiet months since Hannah's arrival. Whoever they were, he thought, they had made a mistake in believing patience alone would keep them safe from him. He had spent 20 years teaching men exactly how costly that mistake could become. Somewhere in Seoul's underworld, an enemy who knew his name, his reputation, and now, apparently, the existence of a bloodline worth more than any territory he had ever fought to control, had already begun looking at his daughter and seeing, not a child in need of protection, but a prize.